B. That's not actually my name anymore, at least not for the purpose of telling this story. Let's just call me Ethan Brooks. I'm 53 years old. I work as an environmental compliance consultant, and there was a time when I honestly believed buying a lakefront home in northern Wisconsin would be the quiet ending my wife and I had earned after 30 years of working ourselves to exhaustion. Funny how life works, because instead of spending my summers fishing off my dock and watching loons drift across the water with a cup of coffee in my hand, I ended up standing face to face with federal investigators while an entire neighborhood stared at me like I had personally destroyed their paradise. 11 people ended up in the hospital. One HOA board member lost everything he'd spent years building, and for 90 days I locked every single resident out of the lake they thought belonged to them. Looking back now, people still ask whether I regret what happened, and every single time my answer is exactly the same. If I had waited one more day, somebody could have died. My wife, Melissa, always joked that I could never completely turn off the consultant side of my brain. We'd be driving through a campground, and I'd notice drainage ditches before I'd notice the scenery. We'd stop at a marina, and I'd point out erosion problems while everyone else admired the boats. She'd roll her eyes, laugh, and tell people, "Don't worry. He critiques water quality the way some men critique barbecue." She wasn't wrong. After 3 decades of helping businesses comply with environmental regulations, certain things simply jump out at you without trying. That's probably why I noticed the first warning sign long before anyone else did. We bought our house on Cedar Ridge Lake because it wasn't flashy. 60 homes wrapped around a quiet 80-acre lake where most neighbors actually knew each other's names. Kids rode bikes without parents worrying. Retired couples waved from their porches every evening. On weekends, I'd usually let nearby families tie up their kayaks at my dock if they needed a place to stop for lunch. I never charged anyone. It wasn't about money. My father always believed waterfront wasn't something you owned completely. You were just borrowing it from the next generation. That philosophy stayed with me. Then there was Victor Hale, the HOA treasurer. If you've ever lived in one of these communities, you probably know someone exactly like him. Perfect smile, perfect handshake, always volunteering, always acting like he was sacrificing his own time for the good of the neighborhood. People trusted him because he handled the finances and organized community events. Personally, I never disliked the guy. I just never completely believed him either. There was something rehearsed about the way he talked, like every conversation had already happened inside his head before he opened his mouth. He complimented my property far more often than felt natural. "You've got the best stretch of shoreline on the whole lake," he'd say almost every month. "Must be nice having enough room for everyone." At first I thought it was harmless small talk. Later, I realized he wasn't admiring my shoreline. He was calculating its value. Last June, Melissa and I spent a weekend visiting our daughter in Minneapolis. We came home Sunday afternoon expecting the usual peaceful drive through the neighborhood. Instead, traffic backed up almost half a mile before we even reached our driveway. Pickup trucks, SUVs, boat trailers, jet skis, campers. I actually thought someone must have organized a charity event. Then I pulled into my driveway and nearly hit the brakes hard enough to leave tire marks. My lawn looked like a public park on the 4th of July. Complete strangers were carrying coolers across my property. Kids I'd never seen before were diving off my dock. 2 jet skis were tied to my private pier. Someone had parked an RV less than 20 feet from my garage. Melissa stared through the windshield without saying a word. Finally, she looked at me and asked, "Did you forget to tell me we were hosting a festival?" I got out of the truck trying to stay calm because maybe there had been some misunderstanding. Maybe one of the neighbors had an emergency. Maybe someone had asked permission while we were gone. Then I overheard a conversation that made every piece suddenly fall into place. A man unloading fishing gear laughed and said to his buddy, $375 for lake access isn't bad. Way cheaper than staying at a resort. I froze. $375? Paid to who? I walked over and asked as politely as I could. "Excuse me, who exactly rented you this property?" The man smiled, completely unaware he had just lit the fuse to the biggest disaster this neighborhood had ever seen. "The HOA guy," he answered. "Victor, nice fellow, said this is the premium waterfront package." At that exact moment, I wasn't angry yet. I was confused, because nobody, not the HOA, not Victor, not anyone else had the legal right to rent out 1 square foot of my land. What I didn't know was that discovering strangers on my property would end up being the smallest problem I'd face that week, because only a few minutes later, while walking toward the shoreline, I noticed something flowing out from beneath one of those parked RVs. And the second I saw that gray stream trickling downhill toward the lake, every instinct I'd developed over 30 years told me this wasn't trespassing anymore. This was something far worse. The gray liquid wasn't pouring out like someone had dumped a bucket all at once. It was slow, steady, almost innocent if you didn't know what you were looking at. Most people would have walked right past it without a second thought. I couldn't. The stream carried tiny white bubbles that clung together instead of disappearing. There was a faint chemical smell mixed with sewage, and when I crouched down near the edge of the slope, I noticed fresh tire tracks leading directly from the RV to the waterline. Melissa came up behind me, took one look at my face, and quietly asked, "How bad?" I didn't answer right away because I already knew the answer. I'd seen illegal discharges before. Construction sites trying to save money, factories cutting corners, campground operators pretending septic systems didn't exist. Every one of those cases had started with somebody saying, "It's only a little bit." Water doesn't care about little bits. Lakes remember everything. I followed the trail all the way to the shoreline where the gray water disappeared beneath the surface, then looked across the lake at children splashing around maybe 50 yards away. Parents were laughing. Teenagers were jumping from pontoons. Nobody had any idea what was floating toward them. That image stayed with me long after everything else was over. I walked back toward the RV and knocked on the door. A middle-aged couple stepped outside looking more annoyed than concerned. "Can I help you?" the husband asked. I pointed toward the hose hanging underneath the vehicle. "Did you empty your gray water tank?" He shrugged. "Victor told us it was fine. Said everybody does it." I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, but because I couldn't believe someone had convinced these people that dumping wastewater into a residential lake was normal. "Sir," I said as calmly as I could, "if Victor told you to drive through a school playground, would you assume that was legal too?" His expression changed immediately. He looked at his wife, then back at me. "We were just following instructions." I believed him. They weren't criminals. They were customers who trusted the wrong person. Victor Hale was the one who understood exactly what he was doing. Before sunset, I walked the shoreline and counted 9 temporary rental groups scattered across my property. Every single RV had either gray water hookups or portable waste containers. Some had already packed up. Others were still draining coolers, washing dishes, rinsing equipment. The more I looked, the worse it became. Disposable plates floating into cattails, soap foam gathering along the reeds, food scraps attracting gulls. I pulled out my phone and started recording everything: license plates, faces, rental tags, drain hoses, timestamps, GPS locations. Melissa knew me well enough not to interrupt. She simply grabbed her own phone and started photographing everything from different angles. By 9 that night, we'd filled nearly 200 images and over an hour of video. Most people think evidence is dramatic. It isn't. It's repetitive, boring, methodical. You photograph the same thing from 5 angles because one picture might be challenged later. You document weather conditions, time of day, distances. It feels obsessive until you're standing in court months later wishing you'd taken one more picture. The next morning, I made coffee before sunrise and opened my laptop. Wisconsin Environmental Regulations, Federal Clean Water Act, County Shoreline Ordinances, Recreational Discharge Rules. None of it surprised me. Illegal discharge into navigable waters, failure to contain wastewater, commercial activity without environmental permits, potential public health violations. I started building a timeline while Melissa called our daughter just to tell her we'd be unavailable for a few days. "Dad found something," she said. That was enough explanation. Our daughter had grown up watching me disappear into investigations that started exactly like this. Around 10 o'clock, I drove to the county environmental office carrying 2 flash drives and a folder thick enough to make the receptionist raise an eyebrow. She asked whether I wanted to file a complaint. "No," I replied. "I'd like to report an active contamination event." Those words changed the atmosphere instantly. Within an hour, I was sitting across from an investigator named Rachel Donovan, a woman who looked like she'd spent her career listening to exaggerated complaints. She folded her hands and said, "Walk me through exactly what you observed." 45 minutes later, she wasn't skeptical anymore. She asked for copies of every photograph, every video, every GPS coordinate. Before I left, she looked me straight in the eyes and said, "Mr. Brooks, if your documentation is accurate, this could become much larger than an HOA dispute." It already was. Wednesday morning, 3 state environmental vehicles pulled into the neighborhood. You would have thought aliens had landed. Curtains started moving. People walked outside pretending to water flowers, while secretly watching investigators in reflective vests collect water samples from 6 different locations around the lake. Victor appeared less than 10 minutes later wearing sunglasses and his usual confident smile. He walked straight toward me like we were old friends. Bit of an overreaction, don't you think? He said quietly enough that only I could hear. People come here to enjoy themselves. I answered without raising my voice. Not by poisoning the water. He chuckled. Actually chuckled. You've always been dramatic, Ethan, and you've always mistaken confidence for intelligence. His smile faded just enough for me to know I'd hit something. Careful, he muttered. You're making yourself unpopular. I looked around at families grilling burgers, kids throwing footballs, retirees waving from docks completely unaware of what was happening beneath the surface. I'm not worried about being popular, I said. I'm worried about somebody burying a child because you wanted extra cash. For the first time since I'd met him, Victor didn't have a clever response. He simply walked away. Friday afternoon my phone rang while Melissa and I were replacing a broken fence post. Rachel Donovan. Her voice sounded different this time, more serious. The laboratory results just came back, she said. You were right. Those 4 words landed harder than I expected. Coliform bacteria measured nearly 4 times the legal threshold. Phosphate concentrations were high enough to trigger accelerated algae growth. Organic contamination had already spread across much of the southern shoreline. Emergency recommendations were being prepared before she even finished talking. By the following morning, the lake looked sick. Green patches floated across the surface where crystal clear water had been only days earlier. Dead bluegill drifted against my dock. The smell, I'll never forget that smell. Imagine wet grass left inside a trash bag for a week under the summer sun. Then multiply it by an entire shoreline. Neighbors started knocking on my door asking if I knew what was happening. Before I could answer, ambulances began arriving. One family after another reported violent stomach illness after swimming earlier in the week. Children with severe dehydration. Elderly residents with infections. A local urgent care center became overwhelmed before noon. By Sunday evening, 11 families had sought medical treatment, including 3 young children who remained hospitalized overnight receiving intravenous fluids. Local news helicopters circled above the lake Monday morning, and suddenly the story that Victor had tried so desperately to keep buried belonged to the entire state. Then Rachel called again. The EPA is joining the investigation, she said quietly. And Ethan, prepare yourself. Once they arrive, this neighborhood is never going back to the way it was. She was absolutely right. Because less than 48 hours later I hammered a bright yellow warning sign into the ground beside my own dock. And when Victor Hale came charging across my lawn screaming that I destroyed his community, he had no idea I was about to destroy the lie he'd been living for years. Victor came storming across my yard before I even finished securing the last corner of the sign. His face was bright red. His finger pointed straight at my chest, and he shouted loudly enough for half the neighborhood to hear. Take that thing down right now. You're scaring people. I leaned the post driver against the fence, looked him in the eye, and answered, Good, they should be scared. He laughed like I'd told the dumbest joke he'd ever heard. You think one fancy government investigation's going to ruin me? I reached into my truck, pulled out a laminated copy of the temporary public health order Rachel had delivered less than an hour earlier, and handed it to him. No, I said quietly. You ruined yourself the moment you started selling something that was never yours. He glanced at the document, his confidence disappearing line by line. Before he could say another word, 2 EPA vehicles rolled slowly into the neighborhood behind him. The timing couldn't have been more cinematic if someone had written it into a movie. Federal investigators stepped out, introduced themselves, photographed the shoreline, then placed official contamination notices at every public access point around Cedar Ridge Lake. By that afternoon, the emergency order was official. No swimming, no boating, no fishing, no recreational access of any kind for 90 days while environmental remediation and water monitoring took place. The reaction from the neighborhood was explosive. Some people blamed me at first because I was the face they could see. Others demanded answers from Victor. The emergency HOA meeting 3 nights later was standing room only. I walked in carrying a binder thick enough to barely fit under my arm. Victor stood at the front of the room pretending to be the victim. This entire situation started because Ethan overreacted, he announced. He brought the government into a private community dispute. I almost smiled. He still thought this was about an argument between neighbors. When the board finally allowed me to speak, I didn't yell. I didn't insult him. I simply placed my binder on the table, opened it one section at a time, and let the evidence speak. Property surveys proving the shoreline belonged exclusively to me. Screenshots from his rental advertisements. Payment records from vacation guests. Time-stamped videos of wastewater draining into the lake. Laboratory reports. Environmental regulations. Finally, Rachel Donovan stood up from the back of the room, identified herself for everyone present, and calmly explained that the investigation had uncovered multiple violations involving illegal commercial operations, unauthorized use of private property, unlawful wastewater discharge, and actions that created a measurable public health hazard. The room went completely silent. One elderly woman who had defended Victor for years slowly removed her HOA name badge and placed it on the table without saying a word. That silence hurt him far more than any accusation ever could. Within 24 hours, 46 homeowners signed a petition demanding his immediate resignation. 7 families joined together to file a civil lawsuit seeking compensation for medical expenses and lost property value. Local newspapers picked up the story. Television crews camped outside the subdivision, and real estate agents quietly admitted that home values had dropped almost overnight because nobody wanted to buy into a community under federal investigation. Victor resigned before the end of the week. 3 months later, he settled multiple claims for more money than most people earn in several years, sold his house well below market value, and disappeared without so much as a goodbye. I honestly haven't heard his name since. The surprising part came later. After the cleanup was completed and repeated testing confirmed the lake was finally safe again, the newly elected HOA board knocked on my front door. Their president, a retired school principal named Linda Mercer, looked exhausted before she even spoke. "We'd like to start over," she said, "and we'd like to ask a favor." They wanted permanent legal access across my shoreline because everyone finally understood how much of the community depended on that section of the lake. I told them I wasn't interested in giving anything away anymore, but I was willing to do business. My attorney drafted a 5-year lease covering a designated community access area. The HOA would pay a monthly fee, fund an environmental protection bond, submit to annual independent water inspections, and accept one simple condition. The first environmental violation, any violation, would immediately terminate the agreement and forfeit the entire bond. They signed the contract within 2 days without negotiating a single sentence. Today, the lake is cleaner than it has been in decades. Kids are swimming again. Fish have returned. Families wave when they pass my dock. And every summer, the HOA pays on time because everyone remembers exactly what happened when one man's greed was allowed to outrank common sense. People still ask whether I enjoyed watching Victor lose everything. The truth is, no. I would have preferred he had simply respected other people's property and protected the lake we all shared. But once innocent families started getting sick, this stopped being about revenge. It became about responsibility. So now I'm curious what you think. Did I go too far by shutting down the entire lake for 90 days and involving federal agencies? Or was that the only reasonable response once public health was at risk? If you had been in my position, would you have handled it differently? Let me know in the comments, because stories like this always seem to divide people right down the middle, and I'd genuinely like to hear where you stand.